Hi, and welcome to Horror Rises, a panel about all things scary. I'm Adrian Wassel, editor-in-chief of Vault Comics, and our dedicated horror imprint, Nightfall. I'm joined today by Syndee Barwick and David Dissanayake. If you're looking to connect and learn more about Vault and Nightfall, they hold all the answers. I'm also joined by Sally Cantirino, Michael Moreci, and Tim Daniel. Some of my favorite creators on the planet, not only because they all make amazingly scary stories, but because at the end of the day, they're horror junkies like me. And if there's one thing that's true of all horror fans, it's that we just want to talk about more horror. So let's get started. I figured I would hand it over for some quick introductions. You guys could each tell everyone a little bit about yourselves and what you've done at Vault and when you realized you were a lifelong horror fanatic. So Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I'm Mike Moreci. I am the writer of Vault Comics, Waste of Space, Mall, which is now Spree. Was written, speaking of horror, with co-written with Gary Dauberman, who's written the It movies, Annabelle, Salem's Lot, all sorts of great stuff. Then The Plot, which is with Tim Daniel, who's also here, and forthcoming Barbaric, with Nate Gooden and art, who I'm not gonna say anything nice about Nate. No, just kidding. I see him over there. Nate's the best. And also writer of the upcoming movie Revealer, which is horror movie. I guess I could say I became a horror fan at an early age. God bless my liberal parents, because I saw Halloween when I was, I should check that. No, I saw Friday the 13th, the original, the first one, when I was probably 5. I have an older brother who's 5 years older. I think he was 9 at the time. He's like 4 or 5 years older. Still wildly inappropriate that he was watching it. But he watched Friday the 13th, and I kind of snuck in with him, and then kind of snowballed from there. And horror was just kind of always around our house. I think the thing I really remember, though, is watching Halloween when I was probably like 5 or 6 years old, the original, the first one. We were just the house that like watched a lot of movies. We watched a lot of horror, and it just became such a normal thing in my house. Like that's just what we loved Halloween. We watched. When I say Halloween, the holiday. We watched just tons of horror movies. Horror was so huge in the 80s, it was kind of hard to get away from. But yeah, that cemented my love of it. I think I can go deeper about why I love it. I'm sure we'll talk about the panel, but like really I was just kind of exposed to it at a young age. I had Fangoria magazines around and all sorts of stuff that it just clicked, and I was really young, so it's been with me forever. That's kind of what brought me to horror. I'm still just as ever passionate today as I was when I was 5 years old, not even knowing what I was looking at.
Like all good dedicated horror fans, just once you're in, you can't leave.
Yeah, like a horror movie.
Yeah, exactly. Sally, how about you?
Hi, I'm Sally Cantirino. I'm the artist on I Walk with Monsters from Vault Comics, written by Paul Cornell, colored by Dervla Kelly. I got into horror, I guess, as a kid. Are You Afraid of the Dark was on Nickelodeon in the 90s when I was a kid. So like between that and like Goosebumps, like both the show and the books. And I remember as a kid, Tim Jacobus, who is the artist of the Goosebumps covers, lived in New Jersey and came to speak at like our summer camps or our school every year. So that was sort of my like, oh, you can make a career out of drawing scary stuff. Someone will pay you to do that. And yeah, I liked Are You Afraid of the Dark? I watched a lot of Mystery Science Theater as a kid, so I was seeing a lot of those like Corman monster movies.
Oh yeah.
Which, for no matter how like cheap or cheesy they are, sometimes they're still just really good and really fun.
Absolutely, yeah. And the practical effects are just stick with you forever.
Yeah, practical effects are always like, it's like, how do I make something as good as practical effects in a comic? How do I draw that?
That's well, let's come back to that question, because that's a great one. I'm gonna wipe my question off the list and just come back to that. because that's great. So Tim, how about a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. My name's Tim. I do branding and design here at Vault. I also write on the occasion. I've written Fissure and co-wrote the plot with Mike. And so, yeah, horror is near and dear, and always has been. And I think it all sort of started Friday nights in the Bay Area, growing up, watching creature features, staying up late, hoping for that Godzilla movie, instead getting Attack of the Mushroom People and all kinds of odds and ends that were, hammer horror, and just being there on the couch, sort of marinating in that every Friday night. And I was probably about 12 at the time, growing up, and that just stuck with me forever. And I think we're all hitting upon something here that, at an early age, it makes a profound impression on you, and you sort of take those things along with you.
You definitely do. Some of them are scarring, but in the best way.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for the introductions. I am going to ask some questions now, and I thought first up I would ask Mike and Tim kind of a joint question, since you guys co-wrote the plot together, and that's not your first foray into co-writing or horror. The plot ultimately is a story about a haunted family, about mental health and how we sort of inherit trauma, process trauma, heal through it. But really, ultimately at the core, it's a story about family. And what I wanted to ask was, how was it writing about family, which is something that is obviously so personal as co-writers? That's an interesting kind of dynamic to me. And I wanted to see if you guys could unpack it a little for everybody.
I'm gonna let Tim, you want to go?
Sure, yeah. Look,
Good.
I'll start with this. When let's say, for instance, you adopt a dog or a pet or an animal, and you bring it into your home. And when you do it in such a way that you don't think about the end. You think about all the joy. You think about all the love. You think about all the wonderful things that entail, inviting that animal into your home and having it become a part of your family. That is, in a sense, for me, as a father of two daughters, and as a husband, that's sort of always at the forefront of my mind, which is, all the love and the joy and the wonderful aspects of being a part of this family here. I never let that darkness sort of creep in, but it's always hovering around you. It's always sort of reminding you that you can't stop it all from happening. You're just going to have to be there with everyone as it occurs, be a part of it, and help support each other in that. And that's sort of, for me, where Mike and I have delved into sort of the family at the core of any of our tales, really. I think that's where it comes from for me. Mike, I mean, when we were working on the plot, I know, you really had I felt you had a sort of something profound to say with your boys. I felt like that was coming through with the dynamic between the two brothers in the story of the plot, Charles and Chase. And I felt like you were bringing some of your boys to it.
Yeah, and that's a really great response. I'm trying to think what else I can say, but yeah, I think that's a part of it. Like it's my boys and my brother and I. I've grown up in that kind of dynamic. My as a matter of fact, if you trace it back, my mom is she has one sister and we're Irish. So there's like 30 cousins, uncles and all, so they're just, it's all over the place. But like, yeah, so I mean, like I've grown up in these kind of like male dynamics, and I think that like one of the things that like has always been a struggle with that I've seen is communication. And that's at the heart of something we talked about a lot, is that the struggle to express very simple, seemingly simple things. And I think that's a very familial trouble as well. It's like trying to express to these people who are closest to you, who know you better than anyone. You've spent, in most cases, more time with these people than anybody else that you ever will, just by simple virtue of living with them. And still struggling to say what you mean and say how you feel. And that's something that plagues the Blaine family in so many literal and metaphoric ways. And that's a scary thing. It's literally haunting them through generations, when really at the core of like their, I guess you could say, resolution, and this doesn't give anything away, it's just the simple act of communicating, talking to each other, saying what's going on. And they just have an inability to do that. And I think that's what horror does. I think what's the best horror does so well is take very simple, common things and make them frightening. Like just like I said, just like people not talking to each other, people not saying simple things, and making that really, really, the consequences very dramatic, very frightening. I think it's something that horror does well. I mean, you see it with a film, Adrian and I were talking about recently, The Babadook. The Babadook is just, it's a lot about, it's about a lot of things, grief being paramount among them, but also it's about the trouble of like, not only being a single parent, which it is, but just being a parent in general. And like, just having a child that like, the more you watch the movie, the more you realize, at first, I think that the little boy is like really kind of like intense. And I think a lot of people have an adversity to him, but like, the more you watch, you're like, no, he's just a regular kid. Like he's just a regular kid. And regular kids are sometimes so intense and so much. And it can be, because of your response, because the intensity of it, horrifying. Like the things that it brings out in you are horrifying. And I think that's what horror can do in such remarkable ways. And it makes these commonplace things so scary.
Well, fantastic. Thank you both. Yeah, that was very, very illuminating. And I want to take that little kernel about making the kind of mundane scary and use that as a kind of pivot to turn to Sally, because ultimately that's what you do so well, better than just about anybody, is create tone and atmosphere on your pages. From monster design to forcing your reader to linger on a page. Frankly, how do you go about that emotional manipulation? Because that's really what it comes down to. How do you approach taking the mundane and making it really, really scary?
I mean, I think what's sort of a thing in horror that I like the most is when your brain fills in the blanks. Whether it's like, in Friday the 13th, where you're seeing things through bushes or through the eyes of, like, you think it's Jason Voorhees and it's his mom, actually. So no spoilers, sorry for this 30-year-old movie. I think one of the things that works for me in horror is when your brain is given a chance to fill in the blanks. So it's like, what's in the shadows, what's in the bushes, what is existing beyond your peripheral vision, what's waiting, like what's scarier than Michael Myers just standing there staring at you, like waiting for him to do something. He's just standing there like a kid waiting to tell you that he threw up. But it's somehow so scary because you're like, what is he going to do? I'm waiting for him to do something. So it's that anticipation, that tension, that something is waiting beyond what you can see, and when it's whether it's in like a vast landscape or a empty field or a barn or like a normal city street, it's like there's something lurking beyond what you can see.
And you always convey that so well. And I walk with monsters. I can kind of recreate all of the settings in my head at any time. I can see JC's home, I can see the barn, but more than just see them, I can fill in those blanks that you're talking about and sort of start to create a sense of like the smell of the place, even the temperature, which is something that just it's a total testament to your incredible art. What about that moment when it tips and it is seen? So obviously you're the artist on I Walk with Monsters. You have another series coming up with us that's yet to be announced. And I happen to know that in both, you get to do a lot of really cool monster design, and that's seeing the thing, right? And so I was wondering if you wanted to tell us a little bit about that moment when it tips and you do the reveal and you see the monster, and what kind of goes into monster design for you on a comic page.
Well, for the reveal, it's like in a movie, you can build tension with the sound design or the soundtrack. You don't have that with a comic. It's purely visual. So it's like, how do I utilize page turns? How do I utilize, different size panels or breaking panel borders? As for monster design, usually it starts with with Paul, with I Walk with Monsters, it was this idea of, it's not really a werewolf, it's a shapeshifter. And it's like, well, how do I encapsulate, being like a kid and you're in that sort of pre-dawn, like twilight hours where things are sort of fuzzy and bluish gray, and it's like things sort of have shifting shapes, like not shadow shifting shapes, but it's like because of the low light, things sort of shift and change and don't have clear boundaries. Or like when you see something moving in your peripheral vision, it's like, how do I create a texture or a monster that feels like that? How do I play with proportion in a way that it feels like you are the character in the story seeing this big monster? And that's one of the cool things about comics, about drawing, is like, you can mess with perspective, you can mess with distortion. And I think for the monster in I Walk with Monsters, it's also like, well, what animal shapes are kind of upsetting to me? Like a gibbon skeleton that has like arms that are way too long freaks me out. Like Komodo dragons freak me out and gross me out. It's like, what animals gross me out? They're like, what textures, for the final monster, it's like, well, what sort of like greasy, awful, petroleum sort of disgusting texture can I evoke? What freaks me out? Well, being like looked at, leered at, watched by a stranger on the subway freaks me out. So it's like, how do I encapsulate these sort of things that upset us into a monstrous form?
Well, you've done it.
So what you're really saying, Sally, that Alien is your favorite film?
Yes. I love Alien. I love sci-fi horror. Alien is great.
Well, yeah, you've done it. I mean, those monster designs have stuck with me from the moment I first saw them, and they always will. They live in my head. And that, I think, is always the mark of something truly scary, is that you never really get to leave it by. Yeah, exactly.
If it sticks with somebody the way that like horror has stuck with us since we were kids, then I have done my job.
Exactly. So I have another question, and this one is for you specifically, Tim. For anyone who doesn't know, Tim co-wrote the plot, has written horror, like The Fissure, which is sci-fi horror, but also designs and helps curate the Nightfall catalog. And I wanted to ask you, Tim, from that kind of perspective, not just from the creator perspective, but from being on the side of designing an entire horror slate, that runs a pretty big range, from monster to haunted house to, just like Hollow Heart, which almost can't be described. It's a queer monster horror sci-fi hybrid. How do you approach that? But ultimately, what for you sets Nightfall apart from horror that you can find elsewhere?
Well, I mean, first of all, yeah, it's pretty easy. I mean, really, when I look at the work that's being provided to me, in terms of what I need to do to design for each title, Black Stars Above, I Walk with Monsters, the plot, Hollow Heart, Picture of Everything Else, they're very unique. And when I see, with Sally being with us here today, when I see what Sally's doing as she evolved the iconography for the monster, and I see it start in one way, as she mentioned, kind of werewolf, and then it begins to evolve and evolve and evolve and evolve until it becomes something unique and something interesting, vaguely familiar because its roots are werewolf, but now something completely new and unique. That makes my job easy because I'm dealing with both the familiar and the new. And I can look backwards because there's such a wealth of horror iconography, whether it's novels or films, other comics. I can look backwards and then I can apply that sort of history to the, so that we're doing the same thing design-wise that the books seem to be doing in terms of their storytelling. So in terms of the iconography as well. So something vaguely familiar that feels hopefully fresh and new. And I think that's at the heart of what makes Nightfall so unique. It's that it's tethered to the roots of the genre, but it is now someplace you've never gone before. Hollow Heart's a great example of that. Black Stars Above is a great example of that. And I can think outside the box of Nightfall, and I can think about other titles that present those elements, horror elements, like Resonant for an example. And so it's really easy for me, honestly. And it's something I love from the standpoint of design. I'm thrilled by each new challenge. And so when we look at, say, the monster iconography for L of Hollow Heart, I see Frankenstein in my head, but what's on the page is unique to Paul Allor and Paul Tucker. So I can work with that and find something fresh and new to say about it. And that's what distinguishes us. I believe that wholeheartedly.
Well, fantastic answer. And your work is incredible, not only as a creator, but also, like I said, as a designer. And, you know, for folks joining us, please click around the Nightfall booth, check it out. We've got some really cool stuff from this year's slate, the Autumnal, Hollow Heart, I Walk with Monsters. We've got panels, in-depth panels coming up for the Autumnal and I Walk with Monsters, where you can learn more about both of those series. The Autumnal is available for as a grab-a-galley, so you can make sure to grab that. And I wanted to ask one kind of last question for you, Mike. Now that you've had your big announcement of Revealer, your horror movie coming out, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the journey from writing horror in comics to writing for screen. What what applies in both and what doesn't. Sally was talking about what applies in the visual space and not having access to something like a score. And that's from the perspective of an artist, from the perspective of a writer. What tools do you have in both genres in both formats, film and in comics? And what tools do you find that you only have in kind of one?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things when we're thinking about similarities is, the philosophical approach just to horror in general. Sally mentioned creature design and Tim as well. And it's interesting because one of the things that I really love, for instance, about the plot, and this carries over to Revealer as well, and it's something that Tim and I, if I remember clearly, spoke about a lot together, was that in issue 1, we really put the creature front and center. There's not necessarily a build up to it. We never really hide the ball. There's a scene, and if you've read the issue, that the creature is just there, and it just is out there, and it's there, and it's still scary, but at no point are we kind of building up to it or hiding the ball or whatever. And the reason, I think, one, I think it's kind of shocking because it upends expectations, for one thing, especially in a comic, because like Sally said, there's a lot to do with page turns. Building tension in a comic is kind of a longer thing that you have to kind of approach, but we kind of upended that by revealing the monster how and when we did. But 2, there's also the idea, this kind of goes what I was talking about earlier. We're talking about, the idea of horror with familial horror. The scary thing in a horror movie, there's so much we've seen it all. And I'm a big fan of, anybody knows me, of the Universal monsters. And you talk about this is the greatest monster designs of all time. You know, they're iconic, they'll never die, you know, literally and figuratively. And like they just last, you know, they just endure. And if you're a fan of horror, there really is very little once in a while I'll watch a horror movie where I'm like, I never saw Possessor, the Cronenberg movie recently. I was like, there's some stuff in it. I was like, I've never seen that before, and I don't know if I ever want to see it again. But you know, like we've seen it all. So the horror, like the shock or blood or monsters or whatever, there's so little that you can do in that space, and I don't really find that interesting. I love a good character design, like what Tim and Josh did to design, you know, what we call Boggy, our monster in the plot. I love it. I love that design. I could never do it myself. You know, I don't have the skills or the talent, but what they did is remarkable. But I think Tim will agree, like the real horror, the really scary stuff in the plot is everything you see with the characters and how we come to love them and come to understand their problems and recognize their problems as our problems. And the same thing, Revealer, that fundamental thing is like these two women going on this journey, you know, we begin to see ourselves in them and their ultimate horror, which has to do with, like, I can't say too much because not much has been revealed.
You set yourselves up for that pun to happen just endlessly.
Yeah. Well, it's why us writers make the big bucks. So we but the cool thing is that, like, you have these two women, they're in this like really extreme situation. It's the apocalypse, as we've said, this demonic apocalypse, and there are demons and they're scary and we see them and they're scary. But what's really scary is when you start to realize their problems and who they are. And that's really frightening. You say, like, oh, their problems are our problems. It has to do with obviously judgment and how we talk about each other and how we look at each other. And that's a very nasty, especially in our world, a very complicated, nasty thing that we're still trying to understand. So it's the fundamentals. If you look at what's similar, it's those fundamentals of the story. Like, what is the story and what makes it scary, rather than just beyond the blood and guts and monsters. Difference, obviously, as Sally said, is sound. You know, it's funny. There's this quote, J.J. Abrams said a movie is made in a sound booth, in the sound mixing. And I never understood what he meant. And I actually was lucky enough to sit on the sound mixing of Revealer and watch it happen. And it's remarkable. It becomes an entirely different movie. Like when you have track after track. I mean, if you looked at, I can't even count like what was happening, you know, in that booth. Like there's just layered track of sound, not to mention the score, but it's so cool. And it changes the movie so profoundly. And I've never experienced it like that. I never understood it. And now I do. And I have such a newfound appreciation for the people who do that work. But it's something that like you just don't have in comics. But at the same time, in comics, you don't have what, and Tim, you can talk about this as well, like pacing and what you don't show. Like Josh Hickson, our artist, was an absolute master of that. An absolute master of like how the size of the panels, how big and how small and how narrow and how tight, and the negative space. Like you can do negative space in film, but you cannot change the frame. The frame is the frame. Like that's it, you know? But what Josh can do, opening it up or shrinking it down, and what he's choosing not to show in the spaces between, is masterful. And you can only do that in comics. It made the plot so scary, and it is the reason that book is good as it is because what Josh did, his storytelling. I don't know who's better. I mean, I don't know anybody, you know, who can do what he did in that book. It's just remarkable to see. I love watching every step of it.
Excellent. Well, we're getting close to the time, but I feel like there's one question that I have to ask now, because of what you were just talking about, Mike, which is a final question for Sally. So when it comes to creating horror in those moments where there's nothing actually necessarily terrifying on the page, sort of how do you approach that moment, the atmosphere, I guess, when you don't have the tools to like sound mixing, when your tools instead are affecting panel, how do you go about creating that atmosphere? And most importantly to me, how do you go about creating like the emotionality of the characters in that atmosphere? Because the thing I can say about your books, Sally, is that the characters all have such distinct voices, and I don't mean just in their dialogue, I mean in how they interact, their physicality on the page, the way they move through a space. For me, that's created an enormous amount of tension as a reader of your work, but I have no idea how you do it. So, you know, I don't know how you make that magic. And I was wondering if you could, you know, tell us about your witchcraft.
See, I don't know if I do it consciously either. I mean, at least with I Walk with Monsters, Paul gave me these very distinct characters, and the way that JC moves through the world is she's very closed. She's very shut to. She kind of keeps all her feelings right here. You know, and David is so cautious and careful and tries so hard to be gentle. Like he's trying to not, neither of them seem to be trying to disturb the world that they're in, you know? I think David tries to tread gently as a human, and JC tries to make herself as small as possible. I think maybe because of her upbringing, you know, she wants to go under the radar. She doesn't want to be noticed, you know, she wants to avoid being seen. So it's like choosing what moments you pull the camera back, pull it out into the world, make them small characters in a large world, versus pulling the reader's gaze or view in close and focusing on their emotions, because those sort of close moments are really the only times that you can try to show what's happening internally, you know. It is that sort of tension between showing what's happening externally in the world around them, what's happening internally with them emotionally. And because comics are a visual medium, you know, obviously, like Paul's dialogue, as minimal as he makes it in this book, you know, Paul's dialogue does a lot of the lifting, but you know, that leaves a lot of like body language and emotion, and choosing what moments to focus close on those emotions, try to communicate what's happening internally without relying on captions or texts or thought bubbles.
I'm going to spoil things a little bit for anyone watching, but there's a scene in I Walk with Monsters where JC, the main character's father, dies, and dies right in front of her. And I was obviously, as editor on the series, privy to the process that you know, Sally put in front of us, and the emotionality you convey there with JC. It's sort of the moment for me. It's kind of like the keystone, like the linchpin of that moment that she resolves to hold all that tension here. And the way you frame the shot, and I know it was a matter of just degrees of shifting how much of her father in the foreground was visible versus not visible, how much we pushed into her face and her eyes, the conveying of that slight change. This is less, you know, a question and more just me saying, like, watching that was incredible. And it's one of those opportunities that I had as an editor to learn from you, and to be able to apply that in the future, the difference that a few degrees can make to conveying all of those things you were just articulating. You know, if we didn't see his eyes, that would change how we then saw JC's eyes in the next panel. And then when we don't, you know, it shifts our gaze. And so I just wanted to point to that moment specifically, because for me, it was a moment where I learned an enormous amount from you, and about what is possible with those small moments in comics and how to make them haunting. So I think we're right up against time. We have some attendees, and I wanted to see if we had any attendee questions from either Alex or Alan before we bid farewell.
You know, as we wait for any questions, I just wanted to note that, you know, Sally, her answers and you're discussing that particular scene in I Walk with Monsters. You know, I was once told by a publisher, there is no room for subtlety in comics. And I think there is when you have a talented artist such as yourself, Sally, when we, yes, very much so. And now when you start to talk about JC and sort of the closeness or the cloistered sense, I always, with her hands in her pocket, I always see her body language and I see that tightness. There is room for subtlety and nuance and really layered storytelling in comics. And it really comes down to folks such as yourself, folks such as Chris Sheehan on Autumnal, Josh Hickson on the plot. That's where that comes from. And I think a lot of times both writers and readers and retailers and everyone receiving this art forgets just how much of yourself you're investing into that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think I won't go on too long because we're at time, but I think comics are a perfect medium for subtlety, because every time you read a comic, you absorb different elements of it. You know, like maybe one read through, you're focused on the text and you miss some of the subtle moments in the art. Or sometimes, you know, you read it a second time and you catch things you miss. I think comics are a perfect medium for focusing on subtle moments.
Agreed.
Well, thank you all so much. We do not have any questions from the attendees. Please check out our Nightfall booth. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got previews for a ton of our horror stories in the program guide itself. The autumnal is available as a grab-a-galley. We've got focus panels coming up on I Walk with Monsters, where you can chat with Sally again and the rest of the team, as well as the autumnal. We have a focus panel there with New York Times bestseller Daniel Kraus and artist Chris Sheehan. So please join us for those as well. And yeah, just explore around the booth, find lots of stuff to creep you out. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful show.